7:14 a.m., April 3rd, 2026. Albuquerque, New Mexico. 12 deputy marshals moved through the parking lot of a private security firm on the south side of the city. Engines off, radio silence. The building ahead was a converted industrial space. Beige stucco, chain link perimeter, 2 cameras mounted above the main entrance. Estimated value of stolen federal property, $2, $3 million. Time between the original warrant and this morning, 19 years. The man they were looking for had been working inside that building for 7 years. He had a fabricated identity, a state-issued firearms instructor license, and no reason to believe anyone was still looking. The original case file had been suspended. The warrant had technically never been closed. And 16 days ago, a fingerprint match out of an Albuquerque traffic stop had reactivated everything. His name at the time of the original investigation was Frank Collado. The name on his current employee badge read Derek Vance. The deputies reached the side entrance at 7:19 a.m. One of them knocked. The case that brought them here had not started with an informant, a wiretap, or an undercover agent. It started with a filing error in a Jacksonville federal building and a digitization project nobody expected to produce anything. To understand what happened in that parking lot, you have to go back to 2005. The Naval Supply Systems Command Depot in Jacksonville, Florida manages the flow of parts, equipment, and hardware that keeps the Atlantic Fleet operational. In 2005, it was processing thousands of line items per week: ordnance components, communication systems, navigational equipment, vehicle parts, personal gear. The depot ran on civilian contractors. Some had been cycling through for years with minimal oversight and routine access renewals. Frank Collado had been one of them. He started as a general logistics assistant in 2003. By 2005, he had a Tier 2 security clearance and access to 3 separate inventory zones, including a restricted storage bay holding night vision components and encrypted radio units classified as controlled military equipment. His performance reviews were average. His attendance was consistent. He gave no one a reason to look twice. The first anomaly surfaced in March 2006. A quarterly audit of the restricted storage bay flagged a discrepancy in the night vision component inventory. 14 AN/PVS 14 monocular units were listed as transferred to a maintenance contractor. The maintenance contractor had no record of receiving them. The transfer documentation referenced a work order number that did not exist in the depot's system: 14 units. Estimated replacement cost at the time, $98,000. The audit flagged it as a potential clerical error. A follow-up review was scheduled. That follow-up review never happened on schedule, because the person assigned to conduct it was reassigned to a different department, and the task was not transferred with her. The discrepancy sat in an audit queue for 4 months. By the time anyone circled back to it, 3 more irregularities had appeared in 2 separate inventory zones. Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened a preliminary inquiry in October 2006. They were looking at 4 separate inventory gaps across a 14-month window: night vision components, encrypted radio units, a pallet of restricted ordnance components, specifically firing mechanism subassemblies tightly regulated under federal arms control statutes, and a consignment of portable communications equipment listed as damaged and transferred for disposal. The disposal contractor had a record of receiving the equipment, but the weight logged at pickup did not match the weight logged at the depot. Someone had substituted the contents of the disposal shipment before it left the facility. NCIS brought in the ATF's Jacksonville field office in November 2006. The joint investigation had a working theory. A contractor with access to multiple inventory zones had been systematically removing restricted military equipment over at least 18 months, documenting the removals as routine transfers, and routing the hardware out of federal inventory through a combination of legitimate disposal pathways and falsified paperwork. The total estimated value of missing hardware, once investigators reconciled 4 separate audit gaps: $2, $3 million. The question was who, and then where had the hardware gone? I spent time going through what's publicly available from the court record and the NCIS inquiry documentation, and one detail kept nagging at me: the consistency of the falsified paperwork. Every forged work order used a slightly different formatting style. Not the same template copied each time, but variations. Which meant whoever was doing this either had access to multiple documentation formats or was careful enough to vary the forgeries so they wouldn't be pattern matched in a review. That's not opportunistic theft. That's methodical. NCIS identified Frank Collado as a primary subject of interest in January 2007. His access log placed him in the restricted storage bay on or near every date corresponding to a documented inventory gap. A background check turned up a misdemeanor from 1999. a minor weapons possession violation resolved through a diversion program that hadn't appeared on his original contractor screening because the record had been sealed at the state level. He had cleared the screening, legally, by the rules as they existed then. But the 1999 charge indicated a prior relationship with unregistered firearms that investigators found relevant to the current theft, specifically the ordnance components. ATF began preparing a federal arrest warrant in February 2007. The process required sign-off from a supervising agent and coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office. That process was moving forward when Frank Collado stopped showing up to work. On February 19, 2007, he called in sick. On February 20th, he did not call at all. On February 21st, the depot supervisor tried to reach him by phone. No answer. 2 days later, his apartment in the Riverside neighborhood of Jacksonville was found vacated. Furniture still inside. Personal documents gone. He had not been notified that he was under investigation. No one had leaked the inquiry. He had simply disappeared. The most surprising part of this case, looking at it now, isn't that he ran. It's that he ran before the warrant was even drafted, which means either he was monitoring something or someone tipped him off. The investigation never definitively established which. The ATF warrant was finalised and signed on March 4, 2007 by Special Agent Raymond Pruitt, who had been running the Jacksonville field office's portion of the joint investigation. The warrant named Frank Collado on 4 counts related to theft of federal property and 3 counts related to fraudulent documentation of military equipment transfers. It was entered into the federal system. It was active. But the subject was gone. The next 18 months produced intermittent leads. A name surfacing on a background check for a private security job in Atlanta. Different first name, same social security number suffix, flagged and then determined to be a database error. A vehicle linked to Collado's sister appearing twice on traffic camera footage in Memphis. Investigated, traced to an unrelated transfer of the vehicle 2 years prior. A tip from a Jacksonville firearms dealer reporting that someone matching Collado's description had inquired about a bulk purchase. The inquiry came to nothing. The description was vague. The U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force took the lead on physical search operations. They worked the case through mid-2008. By early 2009, with no confirmed sighting and no actionable intelligence, the active hunt was downgraded. The NCIS and ATF joint file was formally suspended in April 2009. The warrant remained open. A suspended file is not a closed case. The warrant stayed in the federal system, technically active, practically dormant. Special Agent Raymond Pruitt retired from the ATF in June 2011 after 22 years of service. He relocated to Pensacola, Florida. The 2007 warrant he had drafted and signed had not produced an arrest. As of the day he packed his office, it hadn't been touched in over 2 years. Here's what this case tells us about the gap between the legal permanence of a federal warrant and the operational reality of fugitive investigations. A warrant never expires, but the infrastructure to pursue it does. The person assigned to it leaves, the funding for active surveillance gets redirected, and the file moves to a drawer. The legal jeopardy for the fugitive doesn't change. The practical urgency does. Collado had apparently understood that well enough to act on it. The stolen hardware, meanwhile, moved through channels that investigators would only begin to trace much later. ATF's analysis of the missing inventory, the ordnance components and the encrypted radio units in particular, suggested the equipment had not been stockpiled by a single buyer. The pattern was consistent with secondary distribution, hardware moving through multiple hands before reaching an end user, each transaction adding another layer of distance from the original theft. The encrypted radio units were likely stripped for components, since their federal encryption keys would have made them functionally useless without modification. The night vision components had a broader market. Where the hardware ultimately ended up was never fully established. 2 of the night vision units appeared in an ATF evidence log from a 2010 trafficking investigation in Houston, recovered from a vehicle during an unrelated stop. The chain of custody between the Jacksonville depot and a car in Houston, 3 years later, was never reconstructed. That was one open thread the 2007 investigation left unresolved. There were others. The physical archive where the case files lived included one item that would turn out to matter more than anything else in the investigation. Frank Collado's original access badge application from 2003, standard form, full set of fingerprints, filed when he first applied for contractor access to the depot. The application had been processed, cleared, and physically stored at the Jacksonville Federal Building, in a records archive serving multiple federal agencies operating in the northeastern Florida district. That archive, like dozens of similar archives at federal facilities across the country, had not been digitized. In 2023, the federal government initiated a multi-year project to convert legacy paper records, contractor applications, personnel files, physical evidence logs, fingerprint cards, into a centralized biometric database compatible with the FBI's automated fingerprint identification system. The project was not designed to reopen cases. It was a modernization effort. Make old records searchable, create redundancy, reduce the risk of physical file loss. The work moved slowly. Contracting, equipment procurement, archival sorting. By mid-2025, the Jacksonville portion of the project was in its third phase, fingerprint card digitization. A contractor working in the archive pulled a manila folder from a physical filing cabinet in October 2025. Inside, a stack of contractor badge applications from the early 2000s, standard intake forms, each with a fingerprint card attached. The contractor scanned them in batches and uploaded them to the processing queue. Frank Collado's 2003 fingerprint card entered the AFIS database on November 7th, 2025. 12 days later, on November 19th, 2025, the system returned an automatic match. The matched print had not come from a federal database. It had come from a law enforcement submission, specifically from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office in New Mexico, which had submitted a partial fingerprint lifted from a vehicle in connection with a weapons trafficking stop on October 31st, 2025. A man calling himself Derek Vance had been detained during that stop and released after a technicality emerged in the search warrant documentation. His prints had been taken during processing and submitted through the standard interagency channel. The AFIS system matched his right index finger to the 2003 badge application. The cold file on Frank Collado was immediately upgraded to active. That detail stuck with me when I first read through the timeline. The match didn't come from a criminal database. Collado, or Vance, by then, had stayed clean enough that his prints weren't in any criminal record system. The match came from a contractor application filed 22 years earlier, recovered from a physical archive that had sat untouched for over a decade. If the digitization project had run 6 months slower, or if the Bernalillo County stop had produced no fingerprints, none of this happens. The ATF's National Center for Explosives Training and Research, which maintains liaison with Marshal Service fugitive units, received the notification on November 20th, 2025. The 2007 warrant was pulled from dormant status. A cross-agency coordination package was assembled within 48 hours. The name Derek Vance, investigators quickly established, had a New Mexico driver's license issued in 2013, a social security number that traced back to a clerical mismatch in a Utah County record system from the early 2010s, and a work history beginning in 2019 with a private security firm operating out of Albuquerque. He held a current state firearms instructor certification. His employee file at the firm listed him as a senior trainer with specialization in defensive tactics and weapons qualification courses. Put yourself in the position of the investigators running this trace in late November 2025. You've got a man who stole $2, $3 million in military hardware in 2007, disappeared before the warrant was served, and has been living under a fabricated identity for nearly 2 decades. He works at a private security firm. He holds a firearms instructor license. What he did with that hardware in the years between 2007 and his appearance in Albuquerque is not a secondary concern. The Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force assigned to the case opened a multi-state trace operation in December 2025. The objectives were straightforward. Confirm the identity match, establish current residential address, assess threat profile, determine whether active surveillance was necessary before arrest, and coordinate with ATF on any parallel inquiry into the 2025 trafficking stop that had produced the fingerprint. The October 31st weapons stop had its own open question. Vance had been released on a technicality, a flaw in the search warrant documentation for the vehicle. But what had triggered the stop in the first place, and what had been found, was relevant. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's report, obtained by the task force through standard interagency request, indicated the stop had been initiated based on a tip related to suspected weapons trafficking. The vehicle had contained 3 unregistered firearms. Vance had claimed no knowledge of them, stating the vehicle belonged to a business associate. The search warrant flaw, a missing signature on a supporting affidavit, had made the evidence inadmissible and allowed his release. 3 unregistered firearms in a vehicle. The man driving it was a fugitive wanted on federal weapons-related charges from 2007. The connection between the 2025 stop and the original Jacksonville theft was not established as direct, but it was logged as a line of inquiry. Here's the take that will probably get us some pushback. The decision to release Vance on a technicality in October, before anyone had run the fingerprint match back against federal records, is exactly the kind of bureaucratic gap that lets fugitives operate for decades. The technical flaw in the search warrant documentation was real. The procedural outcome was legally correct. But the system released a federal fugitive on a paperwork error, and if the fingerprint match had run faster, or if the processing lag in the biometric database hadn't stretched into November, that would have been the arrest moment. Instead, it added 2 more months to a 19-year fugitive run. Whether that's the fault of underfunded evidence processing, interagency communication delays, or just how these systems are built, we'll let you decide. But it's worth naming. Surveillance of Derek Vance began in January 2026. Task force personnel tracked his routine over a 3-week window. He lived in a rented house in the Rio Rancho area, northwest of Albuquerque proper. He drove a late-model pickup truck. His work schedule was consistent, arriving at the security firm between 8 and 9 a.m., leaving between 5 and 6 p.m. He appeared to have limited social contact outside of work. No signs of counter-surveillance awareness, no irregular movement patterns. The residential surveillance confirmed his home address and daily routine. It also confirmed one detail the Marshals Service included in their coordination briefing to ATF. Vance was regularly present at a firearms range attached to the security firm's property. He was there as an instructor. He handled firearms as part of his daily professional duties. That fact shaped the tactical decision about when and where to make the arrest. An arrest at his residence. Early morning, before he left for work, would avoid the range, avoid the presence of other armed personnel, and reduce the number of variables. The recommended approach was standard high-risk fugitive protocol: pre-dawn, residential address, minimum 6 personnel, weapons qualified. The plan was ready by late February 2026. Then it hit its first obstacle. On February 28th, Vance did not appear at his residence for 3 days. His vehicle was absent. Task force contact with the security firm confirmed he had taken personal leave. He could not be located at any of the secondary addresses in his known network. The arrest was postponed. Surveillance was maintained. For 11 days, Vance was unaccounted for. He returned to his residence on March 11th, 2026. No explanation for the absence was ever established. Task force assessment was that the absence was likely personal rather than evasion-related. No signs of counter-surveillance, no unusual activity upon return. But it had delayed the operation by nearly 2 weeks and required the task force to reconfirm all surveillance parameters from scratch. Reconfirmation took until late March. The operational window was set for the first week of April. On the morning of April 3rd, 2026, the arrest team staged at a commercial parking lot 3 blocks from the security firm, 12 deputy marshals. 2 ATF field agents assigned as observers. 1 vehicle equipped with communications equipment for interagency coordination. The operation had been coordinated with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, which was notified of the federal action but not involved in the primary arrest team. The target, Frank Collado, operating as Derek Vance, was expected to arrive at the security firm between 8 o'clock and 8:30 a.m. At 7:09 a.m., the surveillance unit positioned near his residence confirmed he had left home. Vehicle moving southbound on a route consistent with his normal commute. The team moved to the security firm parking lot. At 7:14 a.m., the arrest team entered the parking lot. At 7:19 a.m., Vance's pickup truck turned into the lot. He parked in his standard space, near the building's east entrance. He got out of the truck. 4 deputies moved from behind 2 parked vehicles. 2 more approached from the building's east corner. He saw them at the same moment they announced themselves. He did not run. He stopped walking, put both hands up, and said nothing. The deputies moved to him, and he was placed in custody without resistance. He was handcuffed and walked to a waiting vehicle. The entire physical arrest took under 90 seconds. There is something almost anticlimactic about that. A man who had been a federal fugitive for 19 years, who had built an entire parallel identity, who had obtained professional credentials in a firearms-related field, and when the moment came, he simply stopped and raised his hands. No confrontation, no attempt to flee. Whether that reflects exhaustion, calculation, or something else entirely, there is no way to know. He was transported to the federal holding facility in Albuquerque. That same morning, before noon, ATF field agents contacted retired Special Agent Raymond Pruitt at his home in Pensacola. What do you think? Does a 19-year fugitive run change the moral weight of the original crimes? Does the time elapsed make the resolution more meaningful, or just a bureaucratic formality closing a paperwork loop? Drop your answer in the comments. We read them. Pruitt was informed that the warrant he had drafted and signed in March 2007 had been executed that morning. He had been retired for nearly 15 years. He had not been following the case. He was not expecting the call. His response, according to the ATF agent who made the contact, was a long silence, and then a single word: good. The case then entered a new phase, and a more complicated one. The federal identity fraud charges alone were substantial. Collado had used a fabricated social security number for over a decade to obtain employment, a state-issued professional license, and financial accounts. That exposure compounded the original 2007 charges, which had not expired. Federal theft of government property, fraudulent alteration of federal records, and unauthorized transfer of controlled military equipment, the original warrants charges, remained fully prosecutable. The additional question was what, if anything, Derek Vance's activities between 2007 and 2026 had produced in terms of ongoing criminal exposure. The October 2025 weapons stop remained unresolved as a separate matter. The 3 unregistered firearms recovered from the vehicle, the basis of the inadmissible search, were still in evidence. With Collado now in federal custody on the underlying warrant, the October stop became a separate avenue for prosecution. ATF coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Mexico on the scope of charges. The identity fraud alone carried a potential sentence of up to 15 years under federal statute. The original 2007 charges, depending on how they were aggregated, added additional exposure. The October trafficking elements were a separate assessment. The security firm where Collado had worked for 7 years cooperated with investigators. A review of his employment records turned up a detail that deepened the question of what he had been doing since 2007. On 3 occasions between 2021 and 2024, Collado had facilitated weapons qualification training for clients he had brought to the firm independently, outside the firm's standard client roster. The firm had permitted this as a standard instructor-side arrangement. The identities of those independent clients were being traced. One of them had a prior weapons violation on record. Another's identity was proving difficult to establish through standard databases. The investigation into Collado's activities at the security firm was not closed at the time of his arrest. It was opened. The original $2, $3 million in stolen military hardware remained the core of the federal case. None of it had been recovered. The 2AN/PVS-14 night vision units that had appeared in a Houston ATF evidence log in 2010 were a partial data point. They confirmed the hardware had entered civilian distribution, but the chain from Jacksonville to Houston had never been reconstructed. With Collado now available for questioning, investigators hoped to develop a clearer picture of where the equipment had gone, who the buyers were, and whether any of it remained in circulation. Most people assume that when a fugitive is finally arrested after 19 years, the investigation pivots to sentencing and closes. That's not how it works. The arrest is when the information gathering accelerates. A subject in custody can be questioned, their associates can be pressured, and the evidentiary record that was frozen at the point of the original suspension begins moving again. The Collado case had 19 years of unanswered questions behind it. ATF's review of the original 2007 case file, reactivated in November 2025, had already identified several leads that had not been fully pursued at the time. Not because investigators missed them, but because the subject's disappearance had made them secondary. One was a financial connection. In 2006, Collado had opened a business account at a small credit union in Jacksonville under the name of a logistics consulting company. The account had received several deposits totaling approximately $184,000 over 14 months, then had gone dormant. The source of the deposits had been partially traced in 2007 to a freight company with no verifiable physical address. The freight company name had been entered into the original case file as a lead to be pursued. It had never been pursued. With the case reactivated, financial investigators pulled the credit union records. The account, having gone dormant, had been closed and archived by the credit union, but the transaction history was recoverable. The freight company name, run through updated databases in late 2025, surfaced in connection with a separate DEA financial investigation from 2014 that had touched on grey market security contracting in the Southwest. The connection was not direct, but it placed Collado's 2006 financial activity within a broader network of entities that federal investigators had seen before. Not in the context of his case, but in the context of others. Here's something about this case that doesn't sit right, even now. The 2006 freight company connection, if it had been fully traced at the time, might have provided a thread into the distribution network for the stolen hardware. That work wasn't done because the fugitive search consumed the operational bandwidth of the joint investigation, and then the suspension redirected everything. What was left was a financial lead in a closed file. Whether the hardware that moved through that freight company connection ended up somewhere that caused actual harm, whether any of those ordnance components, those encrypted radio units, those night vision devices were used in a violent context. is a question the investigation was still trying to answer as of the time of the arrest. That is the unresolved weight underneath the procedural narrative of the arrest. Not the warrant, not the identity fraud, the hardware. Will this case produce a full accounting of where the $3 million in military equipment ended up? Comment why yes or no. And if you've seen other cases where stolen military hardware was eventually traced, drop that in the comments too. On April 7th, 2026, Frank Collado appeared before a federal magistrate in Albuquerque for an initial appearance on the 2007 warrant charges. His public defender entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. A detention hearing was scheduled for the following week. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicated it would seek detention without bail on the basis of 19-year flight history and the existence of a fabricated identity infrastructure that demonstrated capacity to flee. At the detention hearing on April 14th, 2026, the magistrate ordered Collado held without bail pending trial. The flight risk assessment was unambiguous. The state of New Mexico, separately, initiated proceedings to revoke his firearms instructor license. The revocation was administrative and moved quickly. By the end of April, the license issued to Derek Vance was formally cancelled. The two unidentified clients from the security firm's records, the ones whose training sessions Collado had conducted outside the standard client roster, remained unidentified as of early May 2026. One of the names had resolved to a person with no prior federal record who appeared to have a legitimate professional background in private security. The second name had not resolved. The second name remained an open investigation thread. Subscribe to Cold Warrant so you don't miss the follow-up when that thread closes, or when the full accounting of the hardware distribution comes through the court record. The physical archive in Jacksonville that had stored Collado's 2003 fingerprint card for 22 years had processed nearly 4,000 similar contractor applications by the time the APHIS match was returned in November 2025. Investigators involved in the case review noted that the fingerprint card that produced the match was not the only document in the archive flagged for potential connection to active or suspended federal cases. The digitization project was ongoing. More matches were possible. That is worth sitting with. The routine administrative work of converting paper records into a searchable database. Work that produces no press release, no headline, no arrest on the day it happens. Had reactivated a federal fugitive case suspended for 16 years and produced an arrest 19 years after the original warrant. The Jacksonville depot, where the theft had occurred, had undergone significant security upgrades in the years after the 2007 investigation. Contractor screening procedures were revised. Inventory audit timelines were shortened. The specific access zones where the gaps had occurred were restructured under a revised physical access protocol implemented in 2009. The hardware that had already left was not recovered. The procedural changes applied to future access. The past inventory had moved into whatever networks it had moved into, and the question of where it ended up was still being answered. Frank Collado, born 1971 in Gainesville, Florida, had spent 19 years as Derek Vance. He had worked in a firearms-related professional role for 7 of those years. He had held a state credential. He had trained other people with weapons. On April 3rd, 2026, he became again, legally and in federal record, Frank Collado, subject of a 2007 ATF warrant that had waited in an open file while he built a life that would eventually, through the compression of a fingerprint on a scanner, come back into contact with the case he had left behind. The warrant had been patient in the way that federal warrants are patient. Not because anyone was actively working it, because it never closed. The file was cold for 19 years. The warrant wasn't.